praying for peace while holding panic tightly in the chest, asking God to take the burden while checking every few minutes to make sure it's still manageable, hands open in surrender but fingers curled just enough to keep a grip. This is the exhausting contradiction of wanting freedom without truly letting go. Many people speak the language of release but live in the posture of control. And the gap between those two realities creates a weight that no amount of prayer seems to lift. The truth is, offering something to God is not about losing it, but about finally allowing it to rest somewhere it was always meant to be held. There are seasons when burdens get prayed over repeatedly, but never actually placed down. Nights when anxiety gets handed to God in desperation, only to be reclaimed the moment the prayer ends. Relationships that are verbally surrendered, yet emotionally monitored, with the same intensity as before. This pattern reveals a deep misunderstanding of what offering truly means. It is not a religious formality or a spiritual transaction. It is a relational act of trust that changes the internal weight of what is being carried. Scripture consistently presents offering as a doorway rather than a ritual, an invitation into rest rather than a test of worthiness. Throughout biblical history, God invited his people to bring what they could not carry alone. And every time that invitation was accepted, transformation followed. The heart often craves relief without release, comfort without change, but genuine offering requires both. The difference between holding and offering becomes clearer when compared to physical strain. Imagine carrying a heavy bag through a long journey. At first, the discomfort is sharp and obvious. Over time, the body adjusts, muscles compensate, the pain becomes familiar. Eventually, the weight feels normal, even though damage is accumulating beneath the surface. The same thing happens with emotional and spiritual burdens. Anxiety becomes background noise. Resentment feels like protection. Grief settles into identity. Uncertainty transforms into vigilance. These burdens are carried so long that they begin to feel inseparable from who someone is. But normalization is not the same as health, and adaptation is not the same as wholeness. Psalm 55:22 says to cast burdens upon the Lord because he will sustain what human strength cannot. The invitation itself implies that holding on was never the original design. Yet many hesitate to offer what is already hurting them. Familiarity often feels safer than freedom because it is predictable. Offering disrupts the illusion of control, even when that control has proven completely ineffective. Another layer of resistance comes from the belief that offering requires understanding. Many wait for clarity before letting go, expecting to feel ready before releasing what they are gripping. But biblical examples consistently show obedience preceding explanation. Abraham offered Isaac without knowing the plan. David faced Goliath without guarantees. Esther approached the king without certainty of survival. Faith operates not as a complete map but as a direction, and offering happens in the absence of emotional readiness more often than in its presence. Proverbs 3:5 instructs trust in the Lord with all the heart and warns against leaning on personal understanding. This is not an invitation to ignorance but a recognition that divine perspective exceeds human comprehension. Offering is an act of trust that does not wait for feelings to align. It moves forward despite the discomfort, knowing that clarity often follows surrender rather than preceding it. The question worth asking is this: what is still being managed internally that was never meant to be controlled? Take a moment right now to notice what is being held that no longer belongs in those hands. Not as judgment, but as honesty. Not as failure, but as recognition. Just a quiet acknowledgement of what has been carried too long. Offering feels like loss because it resembles burial. When a seed is placed into the ground from the surface, it looks like disappearance. The seed is no longer visible. It is covered, hidden, seemingly erased. Yet Scripture consistently frames burial as preparation for growth. John 12:24 speaks of a grain of wheat falling to the ground and dying, and only through that death does it produce much fruit. What is offered is not erased but repositioned. It is placed into an environment where transformation becomes possible. Fear often interprets silence as abandonment when it is actually transition. The space between offering and outcome can feel empty, but that emptiness is not absence. It is the sacred pause where trust is deepened and where God works beyond what is visible. Nothing offered to God is wasted. Release does not cancel care but redirects it into hands far more capable of holding the weight. The spiritual mechanics of offering reveal something profound about responsibility. Anxiety thrives where responsibility is misassigned. When someone carries outcomes that were never theirs to control, exhaustion becomes inevitable. Offering is the moment responsibility is returned to its rightful place. Philippians 4:6 instructs against anxiety and instead encourages bringing requests to God with thanksgiving. The shift is not from concern to indifference, but from carrying to entrusting. God repeatedly reassures his people that outcomes belong to him while obedience belongs to them. This distinction is critical. Faithfulness does not mean managing results. It means aligning actions with trust and allowing consequences to rest where they were always meant to be held. The exhaustion many feel is not from too much work, but from carrying outcomes that were never theirs to control. Offering returns that burden to the one who holds all things together. There is also resistance rooted in the fear that letting go will mean indifference, that offering will lead to passivity, that surrender will become apathy. But offering is not withdrawal. It is alignment. It is not the absence of care but the redirection of energy from frantic effort to quiet confidence. Peter writes in 1 Peter 5:7 to cast all anxieties on God because he cares. The caring does not stop when the burden is offered. It intensifies because divine care is not limited by human capacity. Offering allows love to remain without fear, dictating behavior. It creates space for peace to coexist with concern, for trust to hold ground even when circumstances remain uncertain. Imagine what it would feel like if effort were no longer the measure of faithfulness, if peace were possible without constant striving, if rest were available even before resolution arrived. Many offer once, but reclaim daily, creating a cycle of temporary relief followed by renewed anxiety. This pattern reveals that offering is not a single moment but an ongoing posture. Lamentations 3:22 speaks of mercies that are new every morning, and this same principle applies to surrender. Trust is renewed daily. Dependence is sustained through consistent release rather than perfect emotion. Offering does not happen once and remain in place forever. It is a repeated act, a daily choice to place what feels overwhelming back into the hands that hold all things. The language of faith is filled with daily bread, daily grace, daily trust. This is not weakness but the rhythm of relationship. God does not require perfect surrender, but persistent return. The fruit of offering is not immediate solutions but internal shifts. Peace often arrives before circumstances change. Clarity emerges even when questions remain unanswered. Resilience grows in the midst of ongoing challenges. Colossians 3:15 speaks of the peace of Christ ruling in the heart, a peace that transcends external conditions. This peace is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of trust. It is the assurance that what has been offered is being held with care. Offering realigns the heart even when the environment remains unstable. It anchors the soul in something deeper than circumstance, something that cannot be shaken by uncertainty or loss. The transformation is internal first, and that internal shift changes everything else over time. Consider the widow of Zarephath. a woman whose story in 1 Kings 17 captures the essence of offering when resources appear insufficient. She stood at the edge of survival, preparing what she believed would be her final meal for herself and her son before starvation claimed them both. Then, the prophet Elijah arrived, asking her to feed him first. The request seemed unreasonable, even cruel, yet she chose to offer what little she had, trusting that somehow provision would follow obedience. Her jar of flour did not run empty, and her jug of oil did not run dry. The miracle was not an abundance appearing suddenly, but insufficiency sustained through trust. She offered from scarcity and discovered that divine provision operates beyond human calculation. This is the pattern throughout Scripture. Offering precedes multiplication. Release creates space for supply. What feels like the last becomes the seed for what follows. The same principle appears in the life of Hannah, whose anguish over childlessness drove her to a place of complete surrender. In 1 Samuel 1, her prayer was not a negotiation but an offering. She poured out her soul before God, weeping bitterly, and then made a vow to dedicate whatever child she received back to the Lord. Her offering was not conditional on outcome but rooted in trust. When Samuel was born, she kept her promise. She brought him to the temple as a young child and left him there to serve. The pain of that separation must have been profound, yet her song of praise in 1 Samuel 2 reveals a heart anchored in something beyond her circumstances. She understood that what is offered to God is never lost but invested in purposes that extend beyond personal desire. Her willingness to release Samuel positioned him to become one of the greatest prophets in Israel's history. The offering shaped not only her story, but the trajectory of an entire nation. There is something deeply instructive about the way Jesus interacted with those who came to him carrying burdens. In Matthew 11:28, the invitation is clear. Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. The language is active. Come, bring, receive. Rest is not automatic. It follows the act of coming and bringing. Many stand at a distance, hoping rest will somehow arrive without the vulnerability of approach. But the design requires participation. It requires the decision to move toward the source of relief, rather than waiting for relief to arrive independently. The Samaritan woman at the well in John 4 experienced this. She came for physical water, but encountered an invitation to something deeper. Jesus offered living water, a supply that would never run dry. But receiving it required her to acknowledge her thirst and stop pretending she had everything under control. Her offering was honesty. Her admission that she needed something beyond herself opened the door to transformation. The story of the paralyzed man lowered through the roof in Mark 2 illustrates another dimension of offering. His friends brought him to Jesus, but the crowd blocked their access. Instead of turning away, they created a new path. They climbed onto the roof, removed the tiles, and lowered him directly in front of Jesus. Their determination reflected a belief that proximity to Jesus was worth whatever effort it required. When Jesus saw their faith, he responded not only to the physical need but to the deeper condition. He forgave the man's sins before healing his body. The offering was not just the man's paralysis, but the collective faith of those who refused to let obstacles prevent them from bringing their burden to the one who could carry it. Offering sometimes requires persistence. It demands creativity when conventional paths are blocked. It calls for a refusal to settle for distance when nearness is possible. Reflect for a moment on what has been brought to God in prayer, but never truly released. What keeps circling back despite being named in countless conversations with heaven? What feels too precious to fully entrust, too important to stop monitoring, too fragile to place completely outside personal oversight? The prophet Elijah's encounter with God on Mount Horeb in 1 Kings 19 provides insight into the process of offering when everything feels overwhelming. Elijah had just experienced a profound victory on Mount Carmel. Yet shortly after due, he found himself running for his life, hiding in a cave, overwhelmed by fear and exhaustion. He told God he wanted to die. His offering was not polished or spiritual. It was raw, honest, desperate. God did not rebuke him for his honesty. Instead, God provided rest, food, and eventually a quiet whisper that redirected Elijah's focus. The offering of his despair created space for divine intervention. God met him in the cave, not in the dramatic wind or earthquake or fire, but in the gentle whisper that followed. Offering does not require strength. It requires honesty. It invites God into the real condition, rather than presenting a sanitized version designed to appear acceptable. The parable of the prodigal son in Luke 15 demonstrates what happens when offering is delayed until desperation leaves no other option. The younger son demanded his inheritance, left home, squandered everything, and ended up feeding pigs while starving. His turning point came when he decided to return home and offer himself as a servant rather than a son. He rehearsed his confession, prepared to accept whatever position his father would grant, but the father saw him while he was still far off and ran to meet him. The son's offering was incomplete when grace interrupted it. He did not finish his prepared speech before his father restored him fully. The father's response reveals something critical about divine reception of human offering. God does not wait for perfect presentation. He runs toward the heart that turns in his direction. Offering does not have to be clean or complete to be received. It just has to be real. Job's story offers a window into offering when understanding is completely absent. Job lost everything: his children, his wealth, his health, his reputation. His friends accused him of hidden sin. His wife told him to curse God and die. Yet in the midst of unbearable suffering, Job declared in Job 13:15 that even if God killed him, he would still hope in him. His offering was trust in the face of incomprehensible pain. He did not understand what was happening. He questioned, he lamented, he demanded answers. But underneath all of that, he refused to let go of God. When God finally spoke to Job in chapters 38 through 41, he did not explain the suffering. He revealed his sovereignty. He reminded Job that divine perspective exceeds human comprehension. Job's response in Job 42:5 was profound. He said that before he had heard of God with his ears, but now his eyes had seen him. Offering in the darkness led to encounter in a way comfort never could have produced. The suffering was not wasted. It became the crucible where shallow belief was transformed into deep trust. The Apostle Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 12 about a thorn in his flesh, something he pleaded with God to remove 3 times. God's response was not removal, but sufficiency. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Paul's offering was his repeated request. God's answer was an invitation to discover strength in a different form. Paul learned to boast in his weaknesses because they created space for divine power to operate. His offering shifted from demanding relief to embracing the purpose hidden within the discomfort. This does not mean suffering is good in itself, but it does mean that offering our limitations to God allows him to demonstrate strength in ways self-sufficiency never could. King David's life is marked by repeated acts of offering, from his youth facing Goliath to his later years fleeing from his own son Absalom. In Psalm 37:5, David wrote to commit your way to the Lord, trust in him, and he will act. The Hebrew word for commit carries the meaning of rolling something over, transferring weight from one place to another. David understood that offering was not passive resignation, but active transfer. He rolled his concerns, his fears, his plans onto God, trusting that what he released would be held securely. His psalms are filled with this rhythm. Honest lament followed by declarations of trust. Raw emotion followed by anchored hope. David's offerings were never sanitized, yet they were always sincere. He brought everything to God, the good and the ugly, the victories and the failures, and in doing so he discovered that nothing was too much for divine capacity. The feeding of the 5,000 in John 6 provides a beautiful picture of how God works with what is offered. A young boy had 5 loaves and 2 fish. In the face of a hungry crowd numbering thousands, his lunch seemed laughably insufficient. Yet when he offered it to Jesus, it became the starting point for a miracle. Jesus took what was offered, blessed it, and multiplied it beyond all expectation. Everyone ate until they were satisfied, and 12 baskets of leftovers remained. The miracle was not in the boy having enough, but in his willingness to offer what he had. Offering does not require abundance, it requires availability. God does not need human resources to be impressive before he uses them. He needs them to be offered. The act of placing something into his hands is what activates divine potential within it. Think about the areas where scarcity feels overwhelming, the relationships that seem beyond repair, the financial pressures that appear insurmountable, the health challenges that offer no clear solutions, the emotional wounds that refuse to heal despite every effort. What if the offering is not about having more to give, but about releasing the grip on what little is held? What if the breakthrough is not in finding new resources, but in allowing God access to what already exists? Martha and Mary's interaction with Jesus in Luke 10 contrasts 2 approaches to relationship with God. Martha was distracted by preparation, overwhelmed by the demands of hospitality, frustrated that her sister was not helping. Mary sat at Jesus' feet, listening. When Martha complained, Jesus gently redirected her attention. Martha, Martha, you're worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better. His offering was her attention. Both loved Jesus, but Mary understood that presence mattered more than performance. Offering is not always about doing more. Sometimes it is about being still long enough to receive what is being given. The centurion in Matthew 8 demonstrated extraordinary faith when he approached Jesus about his paralyzed servant. Jesus offered to come to his house, but the centurion stopped him. He recognized that Jesus did not need physical proximity to heal. He understood authority. Just say the word, and my servant will be healed. His offering was trust in Jesus, authority over distance and circumstance. Jesus marveled at his faith, declaring he had not found such great faith even in Israel. The centurion's offering was not elaborate. It was simple belief that Jesus' word was enough. Offering does not require complexity. It requires confidence that God's ability exceeds human limitation. Returning to where this began, the tension of wanting to let go but not knowing how. The exhaustion of praying for peace while still holding panic. The contradiction of open hands that never fully release. Offering to God is not about losing control, but about discovering where control was never required. It is not emptying the hands, but allowing them to finally be free. What is offered does not disappear. It is held with greater care than human strength could ever provide. The image is not empty hands but open ones, not loss but freedom, not absence but trust. The invitation remains, quiet and persistent, to bring what is too heavy and place it where it was always meant to rest. There is no requirement to have it all figured out before offering begins. There is no need to feel ready before releasing the grip. The act itself is enough. The trust itself is the doorway, and what is placed into those hands will be held, tended, and transformed in ways that human effort could never accomplish alone.